recognise just how special the woods of the West are. We probably haven't always called them rainforests, but I think we've all discovered them. I was thinking back to when I first visited a Scottish rainforest, and what a lucky idiot I was at the time. Having just landed a job on Isla, I was walking around the southeast woodlands there, and wondering why the canopy was only 4 feet above my head, and what was so special about all this. That was kind of the start of my journey into the Atlantic rainforest and what it meant. And it's living in some fantastic places. Tainish and Glasdrum especially are two places in Argyll I've got a soft spot for. And I'm sure you've all got your own places that you love. So it's great today to introduce Ben, who can really show us through what this is all about. Ben has spent a very long time as a botanist around the West, surveying all kinds of different habitats, but including woodlands in Scotland, in the Lake District, in Wales, in Ireland. Very experienced bryologist. And as a botanist, his name actually kind of goes before him. It was only the other day, somebody asked me what kind of quality of NVC work I had for a particular site, and I said, well, it's an Averis. Like, okay, that's all right then. So you're still all that work that you and Alison did is still going around, Ben.
That's good to hear.
He's also a teacher, an artist, a musician, uses all those media to communicate about landscapes and about vegetation and what that means to a whole range of people. So I think he's an ideal person to take us through what's so special about this habitat that is so important for us. Just some ground rules today. You're all gathered, you're on mute, and Erin is running the technical side of the show today, so she will keep you stumm like that. She's also turned off your video. I think that's mostly to protect bandwidth, but also because we're recording today's session, so also might help anybody who might be concerned about where their image ends up. If we have a calamity like an internet failure, then at Ben's end, and Ben has a backup plan for that, which involves using 4G and a phone, and I will try and fill the dead air probably by reading out one of these botanical textbooks behind me. Fascinating for you all. If your internet fails, don't worry about it. Just go back to the link and log back in, and you'll get there back in no time, I'm sure. And if I could just draw your attention to down the bottom of your screen, you'll see the wee chat box. That is what we want to use to marshal questions. So if you have questions, as Ben's speaking, throw them in there, and then we'll be able to get to those at the end of the day. Our running order for today is I'm going to hand you to Coralie from the Native Woodland Discussion Group and to Julie from the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, just to say a few brief words about those projects. Then we'll on to Ben, who's going to speak for an hour or so with his presentation. And at the end, that's when we'll have those questions and answers. So Coralie and Julie and myself will be looking to kind of coordinate that and try and make it less chaotic than it might otherwise be. And then we'll just have a brief wrap up, and we can all go have lunch if we haven't already. So, Coralie, could I hand on to you first to just introduce Nwdg?
Okay then, thanks Alan. Yes, well, the Nwdg is the Native Woodlands Discussion Group, and it's a not-for-profit society whose objectives are to encourage interest in the ecology, management and history of native woods in the northern parts of these isles, I suppose. We are based in Scotland. Most of our members are in Scotland, but we do have some members elsewhere too. So the Native Woodlands Discussion Group has been going for about 40 years. I've been involved in it since about 2009 and been on the committee for quite a long time since then. We run, in a normal year, we run events. We really like to get out in the woods together and to meet each other and talk about all things native woods in amazing sites. Sadly, this year that hasn't been possible, but we are hopeful and optimistic that we'll be able to do some of that next year. So the fee for this workshop is to help us to put on events in the future. At the end of the webinar, Alan is going to show some details about how to find NWDG online. We have a website, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook. You're all very welcome, of course, to follow us there. We would love it if more people would actually join our society, and you can find information about how to join on our website, and Alan will show you the link later. And I think I'll hand over now to Julie.
I think she's muted.
Julie, you're on mute.
No.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, I was just saying I wanted to share my screen. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So just a very quick introduction for those of you who have never heard of the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest before. Some of you may have heard of the Atlantic Woodlands Alliance, and it's the same thing. We just renamed it because Scotland's Rainforest is a very attractive name compared to Atlantic Woodland. So the Alliance is relatively young. It was formed about 4 years ago. It's the brainchild of the Woodland Trust for Scotland, who are very interested in those wonderful wet woodlands of the West Coast that Ben's going to talk about, but realised very quickly that if they were going to restore and expand these wonderful woodlands, that they couldn't do it alone. So they gathered this group of organisations together, and these organisations all want Scotland's rainforest to thrive once again. And it's a great bunch of organisations. So you've got your usual NGOs you might expect, like Woodland Trust and Trees for Life and Plantlife and Scottish Wildlife Trust and so on. You've also got some smaller organisations like British Lichen Society, Biological Society, and there's some others like we've got the Community Woodlands Association. In fact, you may be members of some of these. And we've also got the statutory agencies like Scottish Forestry and Forest Land Scotland. So it's an amazing bunch of organisations that all want to work together collaboratively for the sake of the rainforest. They're all doing great stuff out there already, but if they work together, they know they can do a lot more, which is why they've joined this alliance. So Woodland Trust started this and then formed the alliance, but last year they signed a memorandum of understanding with Plantlife. So these two organisations have really committed to drive all this work forward together with all these different organisations, which is why I work for Plantlife, but I work very closely with Woodland Trust and indeed all the others. So you'll learn a lot about the rainforest, I suspect, today. If you want to learn even more, you may want to download the State of Scotland's Rainforest, which you'll find on the Woodland Trust website. This was produced by the Alliance last year, and it really states the case as why this rainforest is so important, what the problem is, and what we need to do about it. And you'll see it's a massive area from the north of Sutherland to the south of Argyll. Unlike Native Woodland Discussion Group. Oh, sorry, go back one. So for the next 3 years, we've decided to focus on 4 main areas, and this is the collaborative work that we'll do together. So it's about establishing landscape scale projects so we can really show what you can do for these habitats. It's about looking at how the Scottish Government can better support this habitat. It's about encouraging and enabling landowners, and it's about working together as collaboratively as we possibly can. So we're quite young. I came into post in February, and I've been working with the partners to really work out what is it we want to achieve, who do we need to influence, what's the message we want them to give, them, and what do we want them to do as a result. And we've really been getting our ducks in a line over the last few months, and we're just about to start communicating out. So we don't even have a website yet, but it is coming, and it will come with a film that's going to be launched in December. And I think it's just last week we set up our own Twitter channel. So when I downloaded this picture yesterday, there were 62 followers. There might be a few more. But if you do want to support us, do follow our Twitter channel. And even better, populate our Twitter channel by tweeting about the rainforest and using the Saving Scotland's Rainforest hashtag. And if you use that, we promise we'll retweet you back. Okay, that's enough from me.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Carly. And with that, Mr. Ben Averis.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Alan and Carly. And Julie as well. And what's going to happen here is that Erin is going to share her screen because she's got the file that I wrote as a PDF file. I could share it from my end here, but might be a wee problem with the amount of bandwidth, which can slow things down or can compromise on the sound of the voice and things. So we're going to see pretty soon, here we are, this document, and I'm going to see if I can shift myself off to the right of the screen on my computer. I'm just doing something that you won't see on your computer. Okay, so what I've got here is a document that I've prepared. It's a PDF file with a whole lot of stuff about the rainforests of Britain and Ireland, on a whole bit more about the Scottish ones, because that's where I live and that's where most of the work I've done has been, but also bits and pieces going into England and Wales and Ireland as well. I have it's illustrated with photos that I've taken, and there's a few taken by a friend of ours, Sandy Coppins, a lichenologist, that will appear in here as well, and also some drawings, some pictures that I've done in coloured pencil and ordinary pencil and pen, mixture of things. And yeah, Erin's going to be doing the paging down from one page to another, which is why you'll probably hear me saying something like, and on the next page, so that'll be that she'll know when to page down, in case you're wondering, why does he keep saying, and on the next page, you know. Another thing in general, when I refer to the names of species of plants, which I'll be doing quite a lot, when it's things like trees and most of the flowering plants, I refer to them by their English names. But with the mosses and the liverworts and the lichens, I tend to use the Latin names. That's not kind of to be difficult or anything. In fact, it's generally easier to use the Latin names of those. There are English names of mosses and liverworts and some lichens. Lichens very incomplete. Although actually some of the English names for lichens aren't bad, mosses and liverworts, the English names kind of just don't really work very well, I think, anyway, and I'm not alone in that respect, because they've been cobbled together by a committee in fairly recent times, mainly, I think, to fulfill some official requirement for having English names for things. Latin names quite nice sounding, actually, and I tend to use those because it's generally more clear, it's more straightforward. We all know what we're talking about with the Latin names. That's why it's I'm not trying to be complicated using the Latin names, just using these nice words, really. Okay, so yeah, thank you. I must say thank you. I've written down here a list of things I should remember. One of them is thank you, because it's sometimes so easy to forget to say thank you when you should have. Thank you to Nwdg and ASR and everybody here for coming to attend this session. That's great to have you. It's great to have this amount of interest. So on the next page, we've got, it's a kind of introductory page as well. It's just saying pretty much what I've said. But a lot of the information in this presentation I'm doing now is sort of overlaps with something that I did in a document earlier this year in June. I put together a very informal kind of document about the rainforests of Britain and Ireland, with some kind of very informal, quite a lot of bit of fun in it, really, and diverging off topic sometimes. But for those of you who've read that, I don't know how many of you have, there will be some overlap of material, but there's some additional things in here in case people have read that, so it's not all repetition. That document, by the way, is downloadable from the email address that you can, or the web address that you can see at the bottom of the page there. So we can move on to the next page and start looking at this subject. British and Irish rainforests, very simply, what are they, where are they? They're the very simplest sort of way you could say they're mossy sort of woods, and they're in various parts of the western parts of Britain and Ireland, upland areas really. There's a very rough map. I just scribbled some blue on there to show roughly the parts of countries where they are found. And if we go then on to the next page, we can see why they're in those places and not so much in others. It's because of the climate. These parts of the country, countries, Britain and Ireland, have a lot of rain, particularly the frequency of rain, not so much the volume, as much as just how often it rains. It's the kind of place where people would probably be saying, oh, it's raining again, you know. And other features of this climate, this sort of temperate rainforest climate, is what it is that the winters don't get terribly cold. might sound pretty good compared with really, really cold places in continental climates. But of course, it rains, a lot of rain and cloud and quite a bit of wind as well. So it can be mild. And I've put miserable in brackets. Well, we're familiar with that. We in Britain and Ireland. Summers are warmer than the winters, obviously, but not hugely warmer. In fact, some summer days in the far west can be no different really from a reasonably mild winter day. So people from the continent would probably find our summers very disappointing. Not that much difference between the winter and summer compared to places much, much further inland in mainland Europe, and very frequent rain. A kind of, I'm putting it across there as a rather miserable climate, hence that miserable face in the word temperate rainforest. If we can go on to the next page here and see where in Europe this stuff is. In Britain and Ireland, actually, we've got some of the very best of the temperate rainforest in Europe. But it's also in the very southwest fringe of Norway, northwest Brittany, and far northwest of Spain. And actually just off the map, you'll find it's in mountain areas in the Azores and islands like Tenerife. Those parts of the world are really getting a bit too hot for it on their low ground. But if you go up into the mountains there, especially on north-facing slopes, where it's a bit more shaded, then temperature gets cool again, and again, not much difference between winter and summer. And the map on the right is a sort of summary of humidity and temperature. It's based on two things. One is how frequent the rain is. That will push up the oceanicity index. And the other one is how little temperature varies from winter to summer, and how the lower temperature range will also push the index up. And you can see that the far northwest, particularly Ireland and Scotland, has quite a steep gradient. Having come across from Southeast Europe, it doesn't change much from that continental climate until suddenly in Britain and Ireland it steepens and you get this extreme oceanicity. The Faroes as well, very, very oceanic. And the next page shows a worldwide map, and you can see that the temperate rainforest is pretty restricted in the world. It's in these coastal fringe areas, North America, South America, bits in New Zealand, south part of Japan, and then further inland in some places more close towards the equator, where, as I say, it would be too hot generally, but you go up in hills, bits like the Himalayan foothills and the southern Appalachians, and temperatures are pretty cool, lots of rain, and temperature doesn't vary very much through the year. There would be more dots on that map if it was much bigger and I could fit them in at the right scale, but these would be in sort of mountain and mountainous island areas in tropical latitudes, but they're so small. They're scattered around from the Caribbean, Africa, through Indonesia, those sorts of places. So scattered, very thinly scattered worldwide, no really massive areas with this kind of climate. On the next page, we can actually start to see some of this this kind of landscape. The top photograph there may look a bit miserable. Well, sometimes it is pretty miserable when you're having to set forth into these places and it's just rain, wind. Some of us are pretty used to that. And the weather on the higher ground there doesn't look that inviting, does it? It's clouds down, rain coming, probably wind as well. And indeed, that's one of the things that is quite notable about this far western fringe. We can, we can observe that we get rainforests here, but we know they have to be in pretty sheltered places for the luxuriance of plants to grow and to reflect how humid and how mild it is, how it doesn't ever get very cold. But if you go into more topographically exposed places, especially a bit higher up, then it gets a lot of wind. The wind and the fact that it never gets very hot are really the more dominant features affecting the landscape and this vegetation. So the tree line, the natural tree line, doesn't get anything like as high up in these far extreme western places as it will further east on the mainland, the continental mainland, and right through into Russia and places where winters get so shockingly cold. We'll look at climate maps and think, my God, it's absolutely freezing over there. But trees will grow much, much higher up. So it's an interesting kind of climate. It's in some respects very, very harsh. In other respects, very kind and gentle climate. The harshness brings kind of subarctic aspects to the vegetation in its structure and some of the species. The mildness in the rainforests brings in some affinities with more subtropical parts of the world, again in both structural and species terms. So it's a funny kind of mix, really. Then on the next slide, the next page here, we've got just a quick visual look at some of the ways in which people have been in these places. I've not really studied human history in these places to a great deal. I've been looking mainly at the vegetation. But yeah, people have been doing things in the rainforest zone of Britain and Ireland just as much as they have been in other parts of Britain and Ireland, really. Doing similar kinds of things, cutting down trees to use the timber, bringing grazing animals in, sheep and cattle and so on, coppicing trees and shrubs. There's some coppiced oak on the bottom left, that's in the Lake District, that one. Charcoal burning. People have been doing that in a lot of woods in the West Highlands, and I'm pretty sure that, well, top left picture, that the flatter bit of ground on the left is probably an old one of these charcoal burning places. There's a lot of them, these little sort of flattish benches. Planting trees, bringing in some different trees, like there's a beech there in the West Highlands, and some old sort of farmish type buildings. Planting conifers in some places. There's a larch on the right. So quite a number of things people have been doing in these rainforest woods. Next picture will show a typical scene within some of our mossy temperate rainforest. It's quite a pleasant looking, that's what I've used the word pleasant there. It's quite a nice, you might say, inviting looking scene there. You can imagine just stepping over that stream and having a wander through there. It's not all quite like that. On the next page here, we can see that some of these places, they can be very steep. Sometimes that's because most of the woods in some areas that are left are in steep places where the sheep and the deer haven't been able to get in there, and people haven't been able to get in there so much from cut down trees. Steep and scary, dark ravines, a lot of rocky ravines in some of these places. They can be quite sort of messy. You know that when you're trying to make your way through some of these places, especially if it's not been very grazed, or if trees have fallen down and things and rocks and stuff and tall bracken and brambles all mixed up together. Or it can be messy along with rain and midges, and that can sort of steam up your glasses. Not always the easiest places to get around. But that doesn't stop us from doing it. It hasn't stopped me from going around them. Well, I've had to as well, anyway, to do the work I've been doing. Sometimes people say, "Oh, your work must be like must be a wonderful thing. Must be like going on holiday or whatever to these fantastic places." People say that in bed and breakfast, place where I stay. And sometimes I say to them, "Well, you know, someone's got to do it," and just to see if they'll realise that I'm actually joking when I say that. Yeah, it's okay going around these places. Next page, we'll see some of the trees. Obviously, you get trees in these places because they're woods. What kinds of trees? Mainly the same sort of species of trees as you'll get in non-rainforest parts of Britain and Ireland, and going east into continental Europe as well. Birches, especially downy birch, silver birch is a bit more eastern really. Oak and holly. That's a picture of oak and hollywood in southwest Ireland. There, a place called Tomies Wood. It's incredibly mossy ground layer, all these little rocks. Ash, where the soils are a bit richer, but not so acid. And hazel, there's some hazels along the stream in the Loch Harbour Argyll border. Rowans, there's some rowans on a slope in Argyll. And there's a list at the bottom of other kinds of trees, quite a range of trees you get, but those ones we've seen there are some of the particularly common ones that we get in the British and Irish rainforests. And on the next page, we'll see a quick look at the kind of vegetation that we get on the ground in these places. And from the point of view of the vascular plants, flowering plants, vegetation in a more general sense, it has a lot in common with what we'll see in the non-rainforest parts again. Depending on the soil, acidity. So if it's more acid, it can be more of a mixture of dwarf shrubs like heather, blaeberry or bilberry, whichever, blaeberry call it in Scotland, bilberry elsewhere. Purple moorgrass there on the top left, there's quite a lot of that in some places. It's mainly in wetter places, but in the very wet climates of the west, it can get onto steeper, reasonably better drained ground, where the soils are a bit richer, things like dog's mercury, wild garlic, and GM urbanum, GM revalia, the wood avens, and things like that can grow in there, especially with ash trees. Bluebell. Bluebell is actually a very western species, so it fits in very well with rainforest climates on soils that range from kind of mildly acid to mildly calcareous, mildly basic. That picture at the bottom left has got blaeberry growing, vaccinium growing up a tree. This is an interesting feature I've noticed because it's so mossy in these woods. You get a big layer, deep layer of moss building up on the lower trunks of a lot of the trees, and the bilberry, which normally grows with an underground rhizome just under the surface and then it puts up the shoots. That rhizome's obviously hitting the tree trunk and going up and up and up under the moss. And so it looks a bit like epiphytic blaeberry growing there, but it's not, it's all connected with the rhizome. It's quite a funny sort of thing. It seems to be a bit of a feature. Southwest Highlands, a place like Argyll, really good for it. I've seen it going up to over 2 meters up a tree trunk, especially oak. It's good for that. And then we can move on to, from the next page, moving on from the trees and the ground flora vascular species to some of the things that are, in terms of vegetation, things that really kind of define the rainforest environment here. Mosses and liverworts, and then we'll be looking at also lichens and ferns, because that whole group of species are the things that really show the effects of that very wet and equable climate. Mosses and liverworts tend to be just absolutely everywhere, on the rocks, on the ground, on the trees. And for those who aren't maybe so familiar with what liverworts are compared with mosses, the next page will show a quick diagram of that. Let's take a wee slurp of water here, because my throat sometimes goes a bit dry when you're talking a lot. Always happens when I'm doing a talk. Yeah, most people know what mosses are. They're little plants, kind of, a lot of them are quite greenish, but not all green. And they vary quite a lot, actually. Usually, we'll see some pictures of them in a minute. The growth form of mosses is immensely variable, how branched they are. Some of them are not very branched. Some of them have tiny leaves. Some of them have got big, long leaves, like that unbranched one we can see near the middle of the page. They often have, a lot of them have capsules, which is things that contain spores, which can potentially grow into new plants when they're released. Liverworts, a lot of people understandably might say, what are liverworts then? Because they're less well known than mosses. Liverworts, a lot of the liverworts are a bit like mosses, ones we call leafy liverworts. They look kind of a bit moss-like. But when we look close, we can tell them from mosses because the leaves come in 2 rows, left and right along the stems, whereas in mosses they don't do that, except for one group of the genus Physidens. There's an exception. But Physidens don't grow absolutely everywhere. Most moss you see isn't Physidens. So leaves in 2 rows, and the leaf shapes vary. So if you see stuff that's got leaves that are cut really deeply into 2 or 3 or even more lobes, like that one in the middle there, it's going to be a liverwort. Moss leaves are much more conservative in the range of shapes. They're kind of some variation on oval to triangular to pointed, long and thin, something like that. Other kind of liverworts are thalloid liverworts. You don't have any separation between stem and leaves. It's just one flattened thing. Same shape as a lot of lichens are, actually. So you might say they're quite boring looking things. Maybe. How boring or interesting something is, nothing can be boring or interesting inherently, can it really? I think it's probably just what we make of it, what we can find out about it. So that's how mosses and liverworts differ, and the next page has got some photos to starting with some of the common mosses. These are mosses that you get in the rainforest places, but you also get them in non-rainforest woods as well, and in some non-woodland places like heaths, grasslands, especially in upland areas. These ones all grow mainly on acid soils, but not entirely. The Thuidium, the middle one on the bottom, can also grow on more basic soils. But they're quite big mosses, and you can see just in that selection of 5, there's a big range of variation in growth form. Dicranum Midges at top left isn't very branched, but it's got really long leaves curling over to one side. The 2 ones at the bottom left and bottom centre have got branches that have got their own sub-branches, and the Thuidium's actually got sort of sub-branches. It's divided 3 times. All quite different. The one on the bottom right's got really flattened shoots. It looks like someone's come along and squashed it. And it's quite a bleached white colour. Tremendous range of variation. These are very common species that grow mainly on the ground, but also tree bases and tops of logs and things. On the next page, we'll see a similarly small selection of species of mosses that aren't so widespread. These are some of the many species of mosses and liverworts that are really very western. They're more confined to that part of Europe that has this very wet and equable oceanic, we call it oceanic climate, the temperate rainforest climate, really. And there are quite a lot of these species, and they vary a lot in their shape, just as do the non-oceanic species. That one at the top left, Brutilia, looks a bit like a kind of bottle brush. The Eulotophilanthera in the middle, see those little dark brown dots? I've called them chalk tips. They're gemmy. They're another kind of reproductive structure, different from capsules. They're little bits of cells that can break off, usually the ends of leaves. And sometimes they're a different colour, as they are here. They're brown. And they have the potential to grow into new plants, but of course most of them don't. If they did, there'd be a hell of a lot of Eulotophilanthera going absolutely everywhere in some of these woods, and there isn't. I don't think they taste like chocolate. I've never actually tried, but maybe I'll try one day. The one on the right is a very rare species, Daltonia, which I put a picture of there because it's got an interesting look about it. The capsule, as in a lot of mosses, the capsule has a kind of lid on it called a calyptra, but in this species, the calyptra is all kind of broken up around the edges, in and out, giving a distinctive pattern which enables us to identify it. It's a good job, because if it didn't have that feature, then without the capsules, it just looks really like anything else, very nondescript. So there's a bit of a range of variation in growth forms and appearance for you to see there among the oceanic species. And because the western species are a particular thing that we look for when we go in these forests, I've got a few more pictures of some western mosses. So the next page, we've got a couple Campylopus species, both in the same genus, Campylopus atrovirens, which is quite black, and Campylopus subporodiction, which is green. The black one, actually, that's one of the species that got me first interested in mosses, because at first, when I was doing my first botanical work, we had to look at a few mosses. I actually thought, they look a bit boring. This was not in Scotland. This was down in the eastern parts of Wales, where it's a drier climate. But then one day I picked up this book by a guy called Eric Watson, British Mosses and Liverworts. And I was just thumbing through the pages, and there was this stuff about this moss, Campylopus atrovirens, and it was describing it as something like patches of black velvet on the moorland. And I thought, crikey, I want to see some of this. I don't believe there's a moss that looks like that. So eventually I did get to see it. So you do get mosses that aren't green. There's a black one. It's not all black. There's white points to the tips of the leaves there. It seems actually that most of the mosses that have white tips of the leaves are ones that grow in more exposed open places, as is the case with this species. It does grow in woods, but it grows outside as well. And maybe that the white reflects light a bit to try and keep it cool and moist. The one on the right is very, very rare. It grows in wet, dripping places in the Northwest Highlands, and also in the Himalayan foothills and in British Columbia. Interesting disjunct distribution, other parts of the world with a similar climate to ours. Next page has got a couple of more oceanic mosses. The one on the left grows on wet, acid rocks and banks, especially by streams, but it's pretty common in the West. Nice sort of glistening look to its branched shoots. The one on the right is not branched, it just forms all these dense growth of unbranched shoots all massed together in a little ball, which some people might look at and think, yeah, let's pull it off the rocks, because you could do easily if you want to. I haven't done that. It's much less common. It grows on steep acid rocks and bark of oak trees and things in the west. So that's a few mosses. Next page, we'll look at some liverworts. Leafy liverworts. These are 3 oceanic western species of liverworts that are some of the commonest oceanic liverworts in the western woods. They're quite big ones, actually. The top 2 are quite bushy, shoots all sticking out from the rock or the bank or the bark, whatever they're growing on. They grow on all of those. The one at the bottom is much more flattened, forms patches on moist rocky banks, and has leaves in opposite pairs, which is quite unusual among liverworts. They're not usually dead opposite. The next page has got a couple more examples of liverworts. The one on the left is a leafy one. The one on the right is a phalloid one, because you can see it's not got stems and leaves separated. It's just this sort of thin phallus that forks occasionally. It's just a mass of these thalli. The one on the left, some of the leaves are missing. That's because they've fallen off. You might think, oh, there's something wrong with that. But it seems to be a deliberate thing that some of the leaves are on some species of liverworts and mosses as well, so certain species. Some of them fall off quite easily, and they'll lie on the ground or whatever's underneath there. And it's thought that they have the potential, again, to grow into new plants, another kind of reproductive strategy. So they've got quite a few tricks up their sleeve for reproduction, these species. That one on the left grows on rocks and trees, acid rocks and trees in the west. It has these very prickly looking leaves. Of course, they're not prickly, they're tiny and soft. Quite remarkable holly-like spiny teeth on the leaves. Next page shows how different liverworts can be from each other. The one on the left, Frulania tenerifea, is the western species. Very branched, the leaves are like little scales, very closely overlapping. And if you looked at it really close under the handle ends, especially from underneath, it'd be quite a complex pattern of different lobes and underleaves. Quite something to look at. Kind of purpley brown colour, unusual colour really. And there are a number of species of the genus Frulania, mostly that colour. The one that looks most like that is much, much commoner, and it's got a glossy finish, whereas this one's got a kind of matte finish. The one on the right, Bazania, that's not actually so strongly oceanic on a European scale, but in Britain, it's very much a species of the western woods. Big, luscious-looking, bright green thing, wonderful-looking thing to look at. So that's some big leafy liverworts. Next page's got some species that are much, much smaller. Those are that shows how big they are in relation to pencils. So wow. Those were pencils. Pardon me. That's how these little things creeping on tops of them, on the surface of them, really small. These species are oceanic leafy liverworts of rock and bark in very, very humid situations, and they're not very common. The page following here, this next page, has got some drawings of how they would look if you looked at them under the hand lens. There's a couple of hand lenses. We tend to use these hand lenses because a lot of these plants are pretty small. I want to see them closer to check out what kinds they are, get a better view of them. And you can see there's quite a lot of variation really. Some that one of them has got round leaves, others with oval or egg-shaped leaves, some of them are pointed in different ways. So these are all tiny little leafy liverworts of mainly rock and bark in pretty humid places in the west. So that's a load of visual tour through the mosses and liverworts that we can find in some of those that we can find in these rainforests in the west. Next page, we'll start looking at some lichens. I'm not really a lichenologist, proper lichenologist, but I've got to know a lot of lichens in the places where I've been, because the western woods are very good for them, including some quite uncommon species. So here are some photos just to show some species. The one at the top right and bottom left are pretty common, and the one at the bottom right show the variation in growth form. Some of them are big, some of them stick right out from the substrate, the rock or the bark. the one at the bottom right, there's moss in there, I know, as well, that's more prominent, but right at the bottom right of that picture, right-hand half, it's it's like a coat of thin white paint with little lines on it. It's one of what they call the script lichens. And the next page has an example of some western lichens that we'll see in these rainforests. They're all kind of grey colour. A lot of lichens are kind of pale and greyish. Not all of them, but a lot of them are, whereas mosses tend to be, on the whole, mostly kind of greenish and more saturated looking colour and a softer texture. Lichens often kind of get quite brittle when they're dry, a different texture totally. Again, variation in growth forms here. The one in the middle looks like a bit like a kind of coral. The lichens, one interesting thing about lichens is, unlike most things, each little bit of lichen is actually a mixture of two different kinds of organism, fungus and an alga, and they grow mixed in together. It allows them to sort of coexist and form this this thing that they wouldn't be able to do on their own. How that works? Well, I once wrote a bit of a silly poem about lichens, and this little extract from it kind of explains that. It says, every little bit's really two, because it's made from a fungus and an alga doing pretty good trade. See, a fungus gives a home to an algal cell who does all the fancy cooking, so the deal works well. So most of the material is fungus. There's bits of alga in there as well. Those algae wouldn't be able to live so well out on their own. Fungus wouldn't do so well without them as well, because they do with photosynthesis, they can then provide the food, sugar, starches, whatever, to the fungus. So yeah, works out quite well for them. And in that way, they're able to form these organisms that can colonize and survive a huge range of environments. The one on the right is an interesting one because it's got tiny little holes in it. And the next page has a rather better photo of that from a friend of ours, Sandy Coppins, who's a lichenologist. She saw the original draft of the document I did in the summer. And she said, oh, actually, I think I've got some better lichen photos that you could put in there if you want. And of course, being a totally unreasonably minded person, my first thought was, what's wrong with the ones I got? I don't want to have somebody else's photos complicating this thing. And it wasn't for more than a few seconds really that I thought actually Sandy's photos would be pretty good. It'd be good to include somebody else's stuff as well. So there's a few photos in here from Sandy. That's a really good photo of Menegatsia, she's got there. All those holes in it. I don't know why it has those holes. I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting, unusual looking lichen of acid rock and acid bark in these western woods. Next picture shows, these are back to some of my photos again, with way more Sandys in a bit. Some more coloured lichens. The Lobarion community, it's a mix of species, and some of them are quite big. They have different colours, greens, browns, bluey greys, and so on. There's a couple there, the Pseudocyphalarias, that I've varied in the names for. Brown things with yellow dots or white dots, they're quite uncommon. All of these Lobarion species, they tend to be pretty sensitive to atmospheric pollution, and so they're reckoned to be good indicators of clean air. There's some more on the next page coming up, the 4 species of Lobaria. These are some of Sandy's photos, as they're particularly the good ones to show, especially that one on the left with the 2 Lobaria pulmonaria, Lobaria virens, which grows more flat, whereas the pulmonaria sticks out. These are big lichens, pretty big conspicuous things. they grow on trees, mainly on trees, but also on rocks in the West Highlands and the west of Ireland, much less commonly in other parts of Britain. Lobaria pulmonaria on the bottom left, that used to be more widespread in Britain before the Industrial Revolution. Things like sulfur dioxide pollution really made it really sort of killed it off in a lot of places. And so the next page here, I've begun with some of their words, because the lichenologists, we all have different words for different things. Whatever we do, we've got our own terminology. Lichens terminology for different growth forms. Quite a lot of interesting looking words. That one, crustose placodioid, that's a brilliant word, I think. Arthonioid, it sounds like something out of some kind of funny, some science fiction film or something. But yeah, I won't go into the details of exactly what they are, but they mean different things, like how branched it is, how flat it is, if it's kind of powdery or whatever. Different things go from. So, and there's some more of the Lobarion species there, the Sticta canariensis. That's a funny one. That's what you see there is a green lichen, quite a big one. It could also be brown, looking really very different. That's because it can have either of two different types of alga growing with this. In fact, one of them is not really so much a proper alga. So the commonest form of it is which has not quite such proper algae. You might say it's usually brown, and it's a thing called cyanobacteria with the fungus. And then the other bit, the other green stuff, has a proper alga. Sometimes you get a little green stuff growing on the brown stuff, and then if you're lucky, the green stuff kind of will take over and be standalone green one. It's not very common to see that. Panaria rubiginosa on the right shows these apothecia, little reproductive structures that have got spores in them, and they can help to identify different species based on their colour and their shape, or if they've got a different colour rim around the edge, that kind of thing. So the next picture has a very different looking lichen. It's a close-up of the, well, one of those script lichens, the Graphis scripta. Like the whole thing's been painted a thin layer of white paint, which makes it what they call a crustose lichen. And then the reproductive structures, instead of being little dots like that, those round reddish things, they are all made into narrow, thin lines. Next picture, I was just experimenting, seeing how quick, if you're doing things in a rush, there's some as well, thinking better draw a picture very, very quickly. And that's a script lichen, and then some kind of made up. Well, I thought it's easy. It's surprising how easy you put a few circles there and colour them in on the computer, or you can do with coloured pencils. And there you are. There's a crustose lichen. Don't know what kind. That's like end of lichens for a while. Next picture we'll start looking at some ferns. I'm just saying cheerio to Alison, she's away to do something. There's a lot of ferns in these rainforests. Lots of big ferns, like the picture on the left, of species that we can find in all parts of Britain, really. And the picture on the right shows a very different kind of fern that's more of an oceanic, western, temperate rainforest type of species, a thing called filmy ferns. You'd probably think it was moss or liverwort. See those dark green patches on those boulders there? It's actually a thing called filmy fern. On the next picture, we'll get a close view of it. And there are, in fact, two kinds of filmy fern. Wilson's filmy fern, which is really the commonest in in Britain and Ireland generally. Tunbridge filmy fern, which doesn't go quite so far north. It goes up as far as Rasay. They grow mostly with mosses and liverworts, kind of behaving in growth form more like mosses and liverworts, relatively big mosses and liverworts, on rocks and on trees, in sheltered humid places, steep banks as well sometimes. Killarney fern is kind of similar in that it's translucent. All these filmy ferns are translucent, but it's bigger and more branched, and it likes really wet places. And to find it growing in its full form with the frond properly grown is very rare. They found in recent decades that it can also survive for a long time, indefinitely. I think in a gametophyte form, it's just like a thin crust of quite boring looking green stuff on a rock, like a smear of alga or something. But the big thing, as I photographed there, it's in very, very wet places, and so wet and dripping, I couldn't get very close, so I had to zoom the camera in, and it was being dripped on by water all the time, so it wasn't it was moving about quite a bit, and the level of light wasn't very high. That's why it came out a bit of a blurred photo. Next picture shows a more ordinary looking fern. Hay-scented buckler fern. It looks very similar to the broad buckler fern, which is very common through much of Britain, and not just in rainforest areas. But this one is a strictly western oceanic species, very typical of a lot of rainforests on acid ground, acid banks. You can tell it from the ordinary broad buckler fern because the edges of the little leaflets, or pinnules as we should really call them, I suppose, but call them leaflets, okay, are kind of upturned around the edges. Gives it a sort of crisp looking texture. And the frond as a whole, very common to see it curving to one side a bit. So it's quite a decent looking thing, but from a distance you might just pass it by as one of the ordinary buckler ferns. So there's a quick look at the ferns. Now, for our next page, we'll have a quick look at some of the sort of physical factors in these rainforests that have a lot of variation in them. Things like acidity is the first one, and in which the variation is reflected in the species composition of the vegetation, like different species preferring certain things like acidity. A lot of the oceanic mosses and liverworts, and a fair number of the lichens too, and the ferns, do very well on acid rocks or acid bark or acid humus, peaty banks and things. And the western species as a whole, by the way, tend to grow mostly on steep surfaces of rock and bark, or steep banks, compared with the sort of forest floor, the more extensive forest floor just on the ground generally, which is usually more full of common, more widespread mosses and vascular plants, and not so much in the way of lichens on the forest floor either. Lichens are mainly rocks and bark. So the one on the left is an example of one of the many that likes it acid. The one on the right is one of those that that likes it more base-rich or calcareous. That Marquesina grows on things like limestone and basalt, and it's black. We had a black moss earlier. There's a black liverwort, an amazing-looking thing. The next page, just to summarise these things very briefly, this next one is light. A lot of the so there's a lot of shady habitats in these rainforests. It's woodland anyway, so some degree of shade. Not surprising though that a lot of these western species will really want to have it pretty shaded, because if they want humidity, it's not going to be so good for them to be in the open where more light whacks in and they can dry out more easily. Although some oceanic species are adapted to conditions, but many of them are well adapted to the woodland environment, so they like a bit of shade. At a very broad general level, one can sort of say that lichens on the whole tend to be a bit more going for light, than mosses and liverworts, which tend to be more abundant and more diverse species mixtures in more shady places. But it's not just it's not as simple as that, because you get mixtures of the two. There's an awful lot of overlap between lichens and mosses and liverworts in terms of their sort of light preference. So they grow together in mixtures all over the place. But as habitat gets lighter, especially, for example, trees, the upper parts of trees, branches and twigs, it's very common to see more lichen growth up there than moss growth. Then when you get into the really shady, sheltered places in ravines and the bottoms of tree trunks, very common to see is more moss and liverwort than lichen. So the next page is another one is temperature. Some like it warmer, some like it cooler. These western species, they all like it to general humid, rainy kind of climates, and not that much variation between summer and winter. Winter's not too cold, summer's not too hot. But some of them, like those two on the left, they really need quite a bit of warmth. They prefer some warmth. The two on the right are well adapted to much colder conditions. The Leptodon can also take it actually quite dry for a bit longer than a lot of these other oceanic species. So it can grow in very well-lit places. And its shoots sort of curl up into like little balls when it's dry. That was in Devon, that one, and the Dumortiera was also Devon. As the Dumortiera is on the left, is a thalloid liverwort. Quite a good example of growth form, thalloid liverwort. The ones on the right is a lichen, the far right, Platysmetia norvegica. It grows in woods in the north, far north, and also out in the open in some places too. Kind of northern oceanic arboreal species. Interesting lichen. The Scapania ornithopodioides is one of a number of pretty uncommon, quite rare really, northern oceanic liverworts. We'll see some photos, more of them in a bit. And the interesting thing about this one is that when it's moist, it's got a smell. That's a moist specimen there. Obviously, we can't smell it from here, but it's the smell. You know, if you go to the shop and you buy, or maybe you've ordered it online, some electronic device, a computer, a printer, whatever, and it comes maybe in a box. You open the box and there's a plastic, some kind of plastic wrapping inside. You open that to get the thing out. And maybe you're quite excited because it's new, it's a brand new thing. And there's a smell. So that kind of plastic wrapping inside the box, I don't know how to describe the smell, except maybe it's got a kind of slightly orangey sort of aspect to it. This particular smell, Scapania ornithopodioides, exactly that smell. You know, you can be out up on the mountains somewhere and you find that species, and you especially if you rub it between your finger and thumb and smell it, or just put your nose close to the plant, you can smell that, and straight away it brings to mind sort of being in whatever, one of those big shops looking at stuff, or when you've got some thing and you brought it home and you're unwrapping it. It's, I don't know, there's some chemical in there. So warm and cool. The next page has got a little bit more of this warm and cool loving species. Here are some that like it warm, hence they have a more southern distribution. And they grow in places, especially places like Southwest Island. There's Torque Waterfall in Southwest Island. I just did a quick sketch of that the other day because it seemed, I heard there were some people from Ireland maybe going to be coming on this. I haven't got very many pictures of Ireland. So I found a photograph online of a few photos of Torque Waterfall, and I did a quick sketch. I have been there. Actually, it was years ago before I had a camera, so I didn't have any pictures of my own. Semitophyllum demissum, that moss on the left, grows in places like that, although I don't think it's actually been recorded at Torque. It also grows in Wales. Radula holtii, Southwest Ireland and the Midwest of Ireland, and then it's been found a couple of places in the west of Scotland. I found it, that one on the right, it's actually right up in west of Ross, which is its northernmost site. A very, very surprising find. And only a week before then, I'd seen it where a friend of mine, Nick, had found it in the Midwest Highlands, quite a bit further south. So these things like it warm and wet, mild and wet. And the next page, we look some more at things that like it cool, hence they're more northern. Places like that pine birch rainforest in west of Ross, we can see there. And the kind of species that we can get in some of the, especially north-facing places and higher up into the hills in the Northwest Highlands, overlap with species that we get in north-facing slopes in the mountains. In some places there can be continuity. The wood grades up into these heaths. In other places not. So just these heaths on north-facing slopes where it's not been burned because they're very vulnerable to burning. Funny mixture of species. The next page has got some close-ups of them. They're really quite big and bright-looking things. They grow amongst heather and blaeberry in north-facing places. And yeah, different shapes, different colours. There's one, that second from the left looks a bit like the Scapania ornithopodioides, but it's got a more prickly-looking edge to the leaf, and it's rarer. And it doesn't have that funny smell like the electronic goods smell to it. Funny thing about some of these northern oceanic liverworts is that they grow in these, the upper edges of some of these rainforests, and even more out in the heaths, a kind of rainforest heath you could call them, in Scotland and Ireland. little tiny bits in Norway and the Faroes, England, and Lake District and North Wales, mainly Scotland and Ireland, and then we find them in Yunnan, around there, in the Himalayan foothills, and in the west of British Columbia, the Atlantic seaboard. Some of them a few other places in the world as well. There's again parts of the world with the same climate. They're a long, long way from each other, but they've got this rather similar humid and cool climate. So that's temperature. So acidity and temperature. Some of these big factors with a lot of variation. And next page is to do with wetness. It's all pretty wet, at least the climate's pretty wet in the west. But the western species do vary in terms of the actual surface they're growing on. Some of them do like to be immersed in water for quite a lot of time, to have water dripping on them, splashing on them, like the one on the right, the Platyhypnidium. Perhaps not the kind of moss you would choose to show someone if you want to enthuse someone about mosses and they weren't previously very interested. You could maybe do a bit better than that one, but the one on the left is quite different. It's a funny looking thing. It's tiny little liverworts that likes a habitat, a substrate surface that comparatively dry, even though it's in these western parts of Europe. Doesn't like to get terribly wet. Grows mainly on the bark of trees, kind of base-rich bark or nutrient-rich bark, things like elder and hazel and willows. And the next few pages, next one here shows another of the wet-loving species that likes to be right by the water. So even though they're in the west, in the rainy west, their need for water is so much they will even want to be right by the watercourse at the same time. Isothecium holtii, a bit more spectacular than the Platyhypnidium on the previous page. Big bushy thing with a golden colour to it, forms great big patches on the most of the upper parts of rocks, not right down immersed in the stream, but a little bit higher up, but still in the riparian zone. Next picture, got a quite different looking one. This is a leafy liverwort called Jubila Hutchinsa. Forms these dark, wet, squelchy looking patches, quite hidden really in dark recesses right by the water. That one's by a waterfall in Argyll. Some quite difficult to get to, some of those places. Sometimes I've had to get a long stick to try and grab a little bit because I couldn't get there because the water was too deep, and see if I can pull a bit of it across on the end of a stick. And of course, what can happen then is that it falls off the stick before you get it back to where you are on the other side of the stream. So that's Jubila Hutchinsa, a funny looking thing. It's a kind of bluey green colour, distinctive when you get close. It's got sharp, prickly looking teeth to the edges of the leaves. Here's another couple, next page. These are rare species of Radula that like it dripping, kind of wet dripping places and fairly shaded as well. Radula voluta, these are very western, Radula voluta, Radula holtii. You might wonder why I put some notes there, a couple of quavers by the Radula voluta. That's because I once located the population of that species by sound. It's not that the things make noise; they just kind of sit there pretty quietly, very quietly. But I was walking along the road on the island of Mull, doing some vegetation survey, and I heard this tinkling sound. Obviously, water dripping down from some woods just a bit above the road. And I thought to myself, that's got to be Radula voluta, because the amount of water, it sounded like it was this sort of tinkling sound. It was regular, it was coming down there, reasonable amount, but not too much. It wasn't any kind of like a gush or a torrent or anything. I thought that sounded like just the place for Radula voluta. I went in there, and there it was, with a few other interesting species. It was Radula carringtonii growing there. Again, this is before I had a camera. Otherwise, I'd have had a photograph of the Radula carringtonii. This Radula voluta is from a different place. Here, this photo. Radula holtii, this is the one that I found right up in Western Ross, this really southern species, and that only a week before, I'd seen it in the Midwest Highlands, further south, where a friend of mine, Nick Hodges, had found it. And he told me where it was. And I went and had a look. The reason why I put that oblong shape there is, again, another wee story. I got there, and I climbed over a little low stone wall to go further down to the stream, and there was a cardboard box lying there on the ground. And I thought, oh, someone's just been driving along in a car and they just chucked this thing out the window. Terrible things people do, littering the place. I thought, before I go back, I'll come back to this spot, I'll pick it up and I'll take it back to a car, and first rubbish bin I found, I'll chuck it in it. Anyway, I went further down, I had a look at the Radula, which is not far away. While I was there, I heard a car coming on the road. It was out of sight just about. I heard it stop. And then about 30 seconds later, I heard it start up again and drive off. I didn't think much of it until I got back up to where it started. And I thought, oh, I'll go and get that box. And it was gone. I thought, what's happened? Why would there be a box lying there? This is a remote place, you know, just a long road going from one place to another. I thought, what was in that box? What was in it? It's got to be, I don't know. This was some years ago. Obviously, I don't know. But I've spoken to various people, and people have come up with various theories. There was something wrong, something bad going on. Anyway, what would have happened if I had picked up that box and been walking on the road towards my car, and then that other car had come along? If I'd been a few minutes earlier, I don't know, they would have recognized this box. Yeah, that's my story of Radula holtii in the Midwest Highlands. Next slide here, next page. And in these places where it's very mild temperatures, never gets too cold, and it's also very humid, one thing that can happen is that some of these little mosses and liverworts, especially some of the liverworts, they can just keep growing all the year for a start. And if they've got little reproductive structures of some kind, whether it be spores or gemmy, they can start to colonize a new bit of habitat pretty quickly. And that habitat can include the living leaves of some vascular plants. They can be getting in there so quick that they can colonize it before that leaf has died. So it's still got green, it's still a green leaf, as we see here in the case of some hard fern and a bramble leaf, where on each of them there's a couple of species of leafy liverworts, or leafy and phalloid, right, well, liverworts colonizing the leaf. This is a feature of mainly sort of tropical, subtropical parts of the world where it's warmer still and very humid, and mainly evergreen leaves of some shrubs and things will commonly have little epiphyllus, we call them epiphyllus liverworts and mosses growing on them. But we can find that kind of feature here in Scotland up as far north as Sutherland. I've actually seen it in very, very sheltered places. You can also see there's some moss on the photo in the left, but I don't count the moss because that had crept onto that frond of the fern from another position. So it would have been on something like a bit of wood that was right by it. So I don't count that. But to be properly epiphyllous, it's got to be having grown from scratch on the green living leaf surface. So yeah, a bit of the tropics in north of Scotland, and other parts, you know, western parts of Britain and Ireland as well, but right up north of Scotland. Seems to be the northernmost in the world, actually, as far as I am aware, and I've looked in trying to find information if there's anywhere further north with anything epiphyllous, and not found anything yet for epiphyllous mosses and liverworts anyway. Next pages will be having a quick look at how something can change over the years in these moss and liverworts and lichen assemblages on these steep rock and bark surfaces. There's a lot of coming and going because it's steep, and gravity in time is going to mean that something that's got a bit too big for that steepness can fall off. So we get pioneer things growing as small little creeping shoots or thin mats for a while, and then they build up and more species get in, but eventually it gets too big and things fall off. So these photos a couple of years apart in the West Highlands and the Midwest Highlands. You can see that at the top where the white arrow is, something's fallen off. But where the yellow arrow is lower down, it's started growing just a bit more, so it's colonizing there. So comings and goings going on all the time on a small scale. Next picture has got an example on a tree trunk. in the same area over the same couple of years. A whole load of moss just fell off. That's probably partly because there was so much there to begin with. There had been some conifers growing around in the vicinity of that tree, and they'll create so much extra shelter and shade that it'll encourage the moss growth to get really kind of big and bulky and luxuriant. Then they took those conifers away, and it wasn't quite so sheltered, and a whole lot came off. But it would have been destined, you know, the size of the stuff on the photo on the left, it was destined to fall off pretty soon anyway. In fact, I think it started to fall off in the left photo. And the next photo shows something similar, with some lichens as well. There's Lobaria pulmonaria, that big khaki green lichen. It's increased there actually over the couple of years, but the moss growth, which was already, some of it had fallen off the base and more of it fell off. So more comings and goings, and the mosses and liverworts and lichens can all be kind of all of them coming and going in such complex ways. Some of them may be colonizing, maybe expanding. It might be some lichen that's growing over some moss, or it might be some moss or liverwort growing over some bit of lichen. Whole load of interactions which will vary in so many ways depending on what the species are, what their sizes are, and what the steepness is of the surface, all kinds of things, how sheltered it is and how light it is. Another one on the next page is a rock in the West Highlands, whereas some Plagiochila heterophylla, it's another western oceanic liverwort. This is over a period of 15 years, 3 different occasions. If I go back down that road again, actually I have been down that road since, but I didn't stop to take a photograph. But I should do another one next time I'm down there, because I can find that rock. It's not very far from the road, the bottom edge of some rainforest. The Plagiochila is the bulk of that vegetation on the rock, but there's some mosses growing in there, some bigger, bulkier mosses. Again, comings and goings over the years. Sometimes we monitor these things. Those 3 photos there are quite informal monitoring. The previous ones were actually some more of a contract to look at changes over a couple of years. The next picture just shows some of the methods that we can use. Can be quite tricky monitoring things on very steep and irregular rock habitats, but sometimes we can use some quadrats. There's a little quadrat 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters used on some rocks. A knife and fork on the top right picture to mark the right and the left extremes of a population that's mapped out in more detail using yellow pins, so we can locate the rock from enough of a distance to start with the photos next time round, and then see how it's changed in more detail. Sometimes, or the one on the left, I've numbered lots of individual rocks. There's a lot more than that. It's just one part of the photo, and so that we can look at each rock and see if the data recorded for each rock is similar, or if it's different, or maybe in some cases some of the rocks may have changed, which will be interesting information itself. The one on the right is a more conventional quadrat subdivide that's used on the ground to monitor an oceanic moss in one of those rainforesty kinds of heaths. A thing called Herbertus borealis. It's very, very rare. And the next picture shows a close-up of that. So, well, actually not so much a close-up, but a general picture of one of the bigger patches of this huge liverwort. We've gone back to the previous picture now. There it is. This incredible liverwort. It's known from 2 sites in the Northwest Highlands, and one of them is very, very rare. The other one, there's absolutely loads of it, and it goes down into the pine-dominated rainforest, and then it goes up through tall heather-dominated heaths into shorter heaths and right up into the montane zone. And when you're there, you see so much of it, and you think, this thing can grow just anywhere. It's not bothered. Why is it so rare? And it reminds me of another moss that's not an oceanic species at all, but that one on the right called Antitropia, which can grow so big and bold looking on trees, on rocks, low ground, right by the sea to high mountain tops. But again, it's not very common. Why is that? And I think it might be the difficulties of establishing at the beginning that they can maybe have a difficulty then, because you don't see much in the way of very small young looking plants of them. and mostly these sort of bigger, better established patches. So maybe that's what something to do with. I don't know really. Okay, another coming in from another angle. The next picture is looking at first of a series of pictures looking at what we can call old forest or ancient woodland, if you like, ancient woodland indicator species. Starting with the lichens this time, there's a list that exists of what they call old forest lichens. These are ones that are mainly in woodland that has been there as far as the records show for a pretty long time, sort of 300 years or so. Exact date depending on the nature of the data that's available in Scotland is a bit different to England and Wales. But basically this looks like it's been pretty undisturbed woodland for a long time. And most of these are growing on trees. So there's that lobaria again. These are a couple of photos from Sandy Coppins. That's a fantastic photo of lobaria. And the Paneria conoplea, which is a very different growth form on a tree there. And then the next picture's got another lichen. It's one of my photos of lichen. It looks like a sort of splat. It looks like someone's thrown something at the hazel. It looks like you should, if you were there, that you should be looking around thinking, where did that come from? Maybe I should get out of the way. But that's another of these western old forest lichens. And there's a few more on the next page of the genus Sticta. The one on the right, one of the two on the right, actually, Sticta limbata, has got little reproductive structures called Sauridia. They're like powder. And they have the ability to, all going well, which mostly it wouldn't, but they could grow into more new lichens. You also get things called isidia, by the way, which look a bit like Sauridia, but they're bigger, little kind of blobs or sometimes rod-shaped things that, just a bit bigger and tougher looking than this. The Sauridia is like powder. It's like it's been dipped in some kind of sherbety, sugary stuff. All of these sticters, by the way, they have a fishy smell when they're moist, and it's damn hard to get off your hands. You have to really do a proper hand wash to get that stuff off, and the smell can fill a room. It's a very, very strong smell, only when it's moist. When they're dry, they don't really have that smell. And the next page has got some habitat drawing I did of a place called Ballachurn Hazelwood in Argyll, which is actually one of the top sites for lichens, because hazels like this that are old and uncoppiced, or if they were coppiced, it would have been a very long time ago. They then, over a long time, they're able to develop a good variety of different forms of branches, from big slanting ones, which can support the growth of big lichens and big mosses, down to more upright, younger, straighter stems, especially coming through the middles of the hazels, and they're very good for things like those script lichens that grow on smooth bark, or some very small little liverworts, some of those tiny liverworts. So they're good. When they've been coppiced, it's not so good, because you don't really get those very old stems, and some species that may need more continuous shady conditions had a break in the sequence there, and they might get wiped out. Same thing for mosses and liverworts, and for mosses and liverworts and lichens growing on rocks beneath the hazels as well. It's better if they haven't been coppiced, if it's been undisturbed. The orangey stuff in that picture looks like an orange lichen, but it's actually a fungus, an oceanic fungus called Hypocreopsis rhododendri. It grows especially on hazel in these sort of dense hazely woodlands in the West Highlands, and it's also down in Wales as well. Okay, the next few pictures are looking at some of the moss and liverwort equivalents of all these ancient woodland indicator mosses and liverworts. Plagiochila heterophylla, we saw a picture of it earlier on, over 3 different years. It's quite a big oceanic liverwort. It grows mainly in the West Highlands, especially the South and Midwest Highlands. Much rarer on a world scale. It's in Ireland, it's in Lake District, North Wales, but very rare in all those places, and a little bit in Brittany. And then it's down in somewhere like Central and South America. So it grows mainly in southeast-facing woods in the West Highlands is where we find a particular good habitat for it. It goes on other slope aspects as well. But it likes quite a bit of light, but always under the trees. Closer view on the next page of it, both in the wet state and the dry state. There's wet on the left and dry on the right. The leaves roll up into kind of like like thin rolls, like little rods almost. I think that probably helps to keep a little bit of moisture in, maybe, just because it's a species that likes moisture. So it's asking for a delicate balance because it wants light. Maybe it wants light because of the warmth. I don't know the difference between those two. Maybe it needs the warmth, but that has to have some light coming with it. But it also needs the humidity. But the light has the potential to reduce the humidity, especially on a south-facing slope if it's going to be positioning itself there to get that warmth and light. So perhaps not surprising that in a place like that, that it might fizzle out if people come cutting trees down on that south-facing slope. And so it's very strongly associated with ancient woods, as is the next species, Adelanthus decipiens, and also which grows in similar habitats, and the next one, Hageniella micans, which is mainly on more north-facing slopes, but on slanting rocks. Beautiful little golden moss, ancient woodland indicator. And it's very, very smooth feel to it. That's one of the ways you can tell it from a otherwise similar species called Heterocladium heteropterum, which has a much rougher texture to feel. Okay, now, a few pages, we're not too far off the end. The things to do with what people have done in the woods. Rhododendron has escaped from people's gardens, a bad news thing because it just smothers places, casts so much shade, obliterates not just mosses and liverworts and lichens, but other things go on the ground. There can be some kind of recovery to some degree, but it's not really to be expected that it'll be full recovery, although there has been some work done to look at things, but it's not really focused on things like the rare species, the really specialist species that will have been in these places. Best to try and keep the good woods rhododendron free. Another one, the next page, is to do with grazing. If there's too much grazing, then the seedlings and saplings can be browsed by like deer and sheep, and eventually the woodland can become too open, and trees can die off and not be replaced. Hence, people are quite keen on fencing woods to let the young trees grow. If there's no grazing, there is the potential for things to thicken up so much that there's too much shade for some of the light-loving lichens, or that the ground vegetation gets too tall and thick and smothers some of the rarer mosses and liverworts growing close to the ground on low rocks and things. So it can be, we have to think about the balance between those two. People often try and get new woods as well by fencing areas from grazing and either planting or getting a new woodland through natural regeneration, which is usually the better way, actually, natural regeneration. It makes quite a difference if it's on ground that is of currently low ecological value, like just ordinary fields of improved grassland or species poor bracken or heavily burnt dry heath somewhere, compared with wetter ground with things like interesting flushes and special kind of vegetation in some way, where there's more to lose from it's got its existing open ground interest. So there's quite a few things that warrant attention when we're looking at effects of grazing and how to deal with them. Next page is a few other things. Hydro schemes, they obviously take some of the water out to pipe it down to a turbine house, means that less water in the stream, that might be a problem for some rarer species along the stream that need the water. We've got a system now in place for assessing them in Scotland to help recognise which are the ones that really should be best kept free of hydro development. The next pages are to do with pollution, nitrates, nutrient enrichment from things from exhaust fumes and so on, that can, and also fertilizers on the ground can get into water. or other stuff coming down in the rain, can encourage the growth of algae, which can spread on various surfaces and outdo some of the small, less competitive western species growing on rock and bark. Next page is sometimes we might find an exciting find. I found Nwdg curvifolia that usually grows on rotting logs. I found it on rocks in some places. And Diplophyllum albicans, which grows mostly on rocks and banks, I found it on trees. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And then I found that these finds were mostly in places where there had been a lot of pollution of some kind, either sulfur dioxide in past years or nitrate pollution. And pollution had ousted out other things, given space for these things to get in, so it wasn't a very good thing. And then I thought, oh dear, what about the old ancient woodland indicator, Plagiochyla heterophylla, preferring southeast slopes? Was that because they were more polluted, that there was more stuff coming in there and killing off other things and giving this thing to a chance to come in? I don't think so. I think they were in parts of the country that are too clean air for that, and it wouldn't expect to be such a strong ancient woodland indicator if that were the case. Next one is conifer plantations. Some conifer plantations in the west have a kind of microclimate in them that kind of mimics a rainforesty climate because it's so sheltered and pretty dark, shaded, shelter and humidity. Not in the very darkest bits, but anyway, it can be so mild and humid that it encourages the growth of a little liverwort called Colliora to colonize the Sitka spruce needles before they die off, and can colonize other surfaces, even some bits of rubbish that have been thrown into the plantation. Although that doesn't mean that it's going to be okay, as in that cartoon, to chuck rubbish in the conifer plantations. On that milk carton, it got in there after 2¼ years, because there was a date on the carton, but it didn't have the year. So I photographed the different sides of the carton and emailed it to the milk company, and they got back to me with the exact date when it left the factory, which was probably an unexpected kind of email coming into them from their point of view. However, next page shows some. We've actually had some increases now that sulfur dioxide pollution has gone down since the 1950s, and some of these mosses and liverworts are coming, and lichens are coming back quite big time, really. And some of them are coming back further east than we've known them, and even into some urban or semi-urban areas, like Park in Glasgow. Some of those photos were taken, and the Eudota calvescent on the left was from just outside the town of Bathgate in Midlothian. And the next slide is just one where we can think about what does all this mean in relation to what we understand oceanicity in rainforest to be. Was it previously going further east? And we have gradients of tolerance of things like acidity amongst some of these mosses and liverworts and lichens. Less tolerant further south and east, more tolerant further northwest, as is the case with things like black bogrush, Schinus, it goes into acid bogs in the far west, and it's in more base-rich habitats further east. Bluebell goes out into the open in the far west, more confined to woods further east. But sometimes I found it's like that picture there, it's in grassland, not far from here, not far from Edinburgh. The rainforest isn't always mossy. Some of it's much less so on some more exposed south-facing slopes. So mossiness isn't the sole thing, or not necessarily always a way to measure every bit of rainforest or how rainforesty somewhere is. And we can get very mossy bits in some places further east if the microhabitat is very sheltered, like those two locations I've got photos of there. So there's quite a lot of other things to consider about this, what we mean by this western oceanic zone and where its edges are. The next picture is, only about 3 left now, is looking at we try and encourage people to get into these places, not just rainforests, any wilder places. There's some notice boards on a nature reserve, Scottish Wildlife Trust Reserve in the West Highlands. When we're thinking about what's the best thing to do with looking after land, trying to make it better, there's varying ways people do that. Sometimes people are thinking, I wonder what was there before people ever came here. And that maybe we should try and get it to look like that. We don't really know what it was like before then. I always kind of think that maybe the present day is better as a kind of starting point, because we do know what it's like today and we can have some idea of what the potential is. And I just copied in that text. There's a book that some people have written about pine woods years ago. They'd written, to stand in them is to feel the past. And I heard somebody saying that in some meeting somewhere, and those other people seemed to be nodding as if thinking, yeah. And I thought to myself, no, to stand in a native pine wood is to feel the present, because it's like it is now. I don't think you can really feel the past. It's a funny kind of thing. Anyway, the present, certainly as what we've got, we can feel it, we can understand it, and I think it's a good basis on which to proceed, rather than trying to get back to some hypothetical thing that would have been way back in time. We don't really know what it would have been, and maybe, well, especially with climate change, things are different anyway. Okay, finally, these last few is just more to do with how I'm looking at things. Going around places like rainforests, often looking at small plants like mosses in rocky ravines. It's an interesting thing to do for somebody like me who's interested in mosses, and people would be thinking, oh, you do that because you're interested in those sort of things. But much more than that, I kind of think it's a bit has a lot in parallel with looking at other places. Like on the next page, I'm really fascinated to wander around cities, because it's a fascinating environment as well. And it occurred to me that wandering around a rocky ravine, looking at things upstream, is a bit like walking along the street and seeing what's there, what's in the shop windows, what people are doing. The cars and the people are perhaps a bit like water running through the stream or the river. And looking at mosses and liverworts and other plants on the steep banks is a bit like looking at stuff in the shop windows with some kind of nosy curiosity. And throughout all of that, it's just a sense of being in some kind of physical environment, and the just being rather than being in your head, like thinking of your identifying with the world more through your position in society, politics and religion or whatever. But for me, it's just a sense of kind of place and where I am, being aware of stuff around me. There's always been, or played a big part. And the next picture is through illustrating that. A friend of ours, Jilly, we were doing some filming work, the three of us, looking at woodland vegetation. And she sat down, and I remember her saying, I like it here, she said, looking around. And then after a bit of a pause, she said, I like it everywhere, really. I thought, yeah, anywhere. Places can be so massively different, but everywhere is somewhere. Everywhere's got sky above it and clouds and stuff happening. And in a sense, everywhere can have a sort of a sense of wildness. If you're looking for that, everywhere's got loads of stuff in it. And it's not everywhere's the same, I know that, but there's always that common thing, that feel of environment, being in some kind of environment. And so that's pretty much the end. There's the last picture is just basically there to say, a picture of a rainforest, obviously, had to do that tonight, to say thanks to the Nwdg and the ASR for organising it, and for all you folks coming here and having the patience to be here and to watch and listen. As I assume you are. For all I know, you could have all gone because I'm sitting here in silence, But that's it. God, the sun's out. It's really bright. Let's close that curtain a bit.
Thank you very much. As you can see, we all are still here, and that was really enjoyable. Thank you. Just your wee closing remarks there, and that kind of how you approach an environment and put your eye into these places really shed a bit of insight into you, actually. How you picked out some of the detail there and the things you drew through about what's in a rainforest, what makes it special, and particularly through mosses, liverworts and lichens, and picking out that detail, the specialisms they have, the variety amongst them, the number of niches there are in this habitat is really what makes it special. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for that, and for the amazing artwork too.
I didn't draw, by the way, I have to say, I didn't draw all those pictures specifically just for this presentation. I wouldn't have had enough time. They're pictures I've drawn. Some of them I did. That Irish waterfall and that one in Wales waterfall near the end, and those ones on Microsoft Paint. But the other ones are all pictures that I'd done over a period of years up, including this year. Yeah. In case you thought, my God, he's drawn all these pictures really quick. They take a bit of time to draw those colour pencil ones, especially.
I think we can forgive you for that, Ben. There have been a few questions came in while you were talking. The ones that I noticed were about management, rainforest, and being able to create rainforest. Carly, did you pick out anything in particular, or Julie?
I'll let Julie go first, I think.
Okay.
Okay, well, there's a good kick-off question for somebody called LD, and that was about creating new rainforest. So the question was about, obviously it's probably better to start from where rainforests are now, but if there's a cleared area of land, could you just plant some native trees and you get rainforest?
Well, in a way you would, if you were in the right area, in the rainforest zone where you've got the right kind of climate. But of course, there's absolutely no guarantee that that it would be as rich in things like the mosses and liverworts and lichens and ferns as the older ones that we do have. That would partly, our expectations could partly depend on the nature of the habitat. Like if it's rocky, if it's a steep rocky ravine but it hasn't got any trees in it, then it's probably already got in that kind of climate some of those western species, and especially if it adjoins a rocky ravine where there's a greater richness in those things, maybe further downstream, then there's more clear reason to think, well, maybe some of these things might colonize in here. If it's just other ground, especially smoother ground with not much in the way of rocks, there will be certain limits to what we could expect. But things will grow on trees, of course. Yeah. And so it can be worth encouraging some of these things. I think as long as they're not really in places where there's a lot of great interest already, that's one thing. I can see how easy it might be for people to think, oh, obviously less trees now, fewer trees now than there used to be. We should get more trees in. Any open ground, we'll look at it and say that should be trees if it's in potential woodland zone. But a lot of that open ground just has vegetation that's developed over a long period of time and has its own ecological interest, very high interest. And it's a shame to get in there and take the grazing off and everything goes thick. But yeah, you could you could potentially get some interest in some of these places, certainly.
Carly, have you got a question?
Yeah, there's a related question and a comment, actually. So Lisa asked, so is temperate rainforest missing from the Faroes? They're very treeless islands. And Rob Wilson commented, they're likely missing from Iceland for sure. So Ben, the Faroes and Iceland.
The Faroes, there's hardly any trees on the Faroes. Alice and I have been to the Faroes many years ago. Yeah, we had about a week or 10 days or so exploring the vegetation of the Faroes. It's really interesting. Very oceanic, a lot of oceanic species there, but certainly no temperate rainforest. But actually other aspects of the environment are there. We were in a little ravine in the Faroes, and I found a lot of those little oceanic liverworts that I've shown you pictures of, including one that was actually, it was a new record for the Faroes, a thing called Acrobulbus wilsonii. There's a wee picture of it towards the end of that presentation. It's in Scotland and Ireland. And I was looking at it and I thought it was Acrobulbus here. That's always a really good find because it's rare. And then I thought, hang on, we're in the Faroe Islands. It's never been recorded here before. But the thing was, once you're in a ravine like that, it's a bit like you're in ravine land, even a ravine that's sheltered and has got no trees in it. So ecologically, that ravine had a lot in common with the temperate rainforests. So not surprised in some way to find a lot of these oceanic species there. So they don't have the trees, but they still have some of that stuff that is special about the temperate rainforest. Iceland, they've got bits of woodland, and they're encouraging the growth of more. They've got quite a reasonable amount of woodland. I've never been there, and I've seen some pictures of it, and I don't think it's not going to be temperate rainforest because their conditions are that bit colder. Although right on the coast of some of the parts of the south coast of Iceland, there's some similarity in climate, but not really quite as we know it's temperate rainforest. Not the proper stuff like we see here. I don't think so.
Thank you.
Anyway.
Shall I go with another one?
Sorry, Julia.
I'm looking at you, Alan. So there's another one about management, and it's about rhododendron. That skirt of rhododendron you mentioned. So it's a question about, should you clear rhododendron all at once, or would that actually damage the species that are there, and it's better to do it gradually?
The quicker you can do it, the better, I think. There have been places. There was one in Arran where they cleared a whole load of rhododendron out, and they found a little Tunbridge filmy fern growing on trunks of oak trees, and there was a lot of it, and it started dying back, and they thought maybe we'd done the wrong thing here, because now it's being more exposed and starting to die back. But I think all that happened was that because Tunbridge filmy fern is very tolerant of very shaded conditions, that it had actually increased to an unnaturally high abundance. So it wasn't a problem dwindling down, and the fact that they dealt with that rhododendron was a good thing. I think it's so big a problem, rhododendron, so much of a challenge, that if anybody can do whatever they can do, and if they can do it faster, so much the better, then yeah, get in there and do it. And there's more to be gained from taking it out quickly than any losses here and there. And so yeah, I wouldn't hesitate to do as much as you can quickly as possible if the means are there.
Yeah, get rid of it. Okay.
Corley, what's next?
Okay, well, Peter Lowe asked something. He said, is there capacity to create species-rich new rainforest in the north and west fringes, suitable spots in the northern and western Isles? He saw some very nice lichen and moss flora in willow woodland in Assynt the other day, and willow is easy to establish from cuttings from lichen hosting trees. Thoughts?
So yeah, encouraging growth of things like willow, because yeah, willows do quite, eared willow, Salix aurita, does pretty well in some places. In actually the Western Isles, I was over in the US not that long earlier this year, and saw some good areas of it, and it is potentially a good host for some epiphytic oceanic mosses and liverworts and lichens. So if it's possible to have more of that, especially if it's in topographically sheltered places like rocky stream sides, then that's pretty good. It's not something that you could reckon on definitely establishing species-rich rainforestings. The species richness is something that would have to develop on its own as these things colonize, and we can never be certain how rapidly and to what degree they will colonize. But if there are different trees and shrubs getting in there, wherever it is, through natural regeneration or through planting, then having a good variety of species is one thing that can help, especially if it can include things like willows and hazel. Ash would be a good one as well, but planting of ash, maybe with ash dieback, is the best thing. Because they've got a more base-rich bark, those species, at least neutral to slightly base-rich bark compared with the acid bark. So you have more of a chance for getting greater total richness of an epiphytic flora.
There's a related question there, Ben, about can we translocate these kinds of oceanic species into woodlands? Have you ever tried that one? Somebody sellotaped some Lobaria pulmonaria to a tree and it took greatly.
Oh, sometimes they have. Lobaria is quite difficult to, if it has to be in the right kind of climates, definitely. And we've found bits of Lobaria on the ground and brought them back in the west, and brought them back and tried to fix them to some trees here, and it hasn't really worked very well. Not surprising. Within the western areas, possibly, but for a lot of them, a lot of the species, probably not. Things that grow on rocks in very humid situations, especially along streams, some of these rare things, I think the potential for translocation there is very low, and can't really be expected. Better to concentrate on protecting habitat where they do grow. Other things, possibly if you got some material, something that's growing on bark, and there's some bark that's fallen off tree, and it was taken somewhere else in a similar kind of environment, maybe a possibility that it could encourage a bit more spread of that species onto other bark nearby. But generally, translocation of something to then grow there from one place to another is not something that tends to be advised in much of a way, compared with, say, some ground-dwelling vascular plants, digging it up, putting it in the same kind of ground somewhere else, and it may well grow quite happily. Okay.
Judy, have you got another question?
Yeah, I thought I'd stick with the management. So Karina Spink says that she has a 30-acre oak rainforest in Argyll, which has been fenced, and there's about 3 deer inside this fence. So she's wondering, is that about right for these sorts of species?
Depends how much sort of effect they're having, really. 30 hectares.
30 acres.
30 acres. What's that in hectares? I can remember acres and hectares. It's a pretty big area, reasonable area. Some places you do get, the roe deer aren't probably going to adversely affect the bryophytes, the mosses, liverworts, and lichens, and things that make it rainforest. They will chomp away at seedlings and saplings, so they could have an effect on the amount of regeneration that's coming through, and hence the longevity of the woodland. And I wouldn't like to say whether that's, or whether it is or isn't okay to have that number in that area. Maybe it depends on other things, like what the species of trees were. Because things like rowan are very palatable, and animals will focus on that compared with things like birch. They tend not to be, it's not so palatable, and alder. But directly speaking, they're not going to be a threat to the plants and to the rainforest, the mosses, liverworts, and lichens. And having some grazing in there can actually be a good thing to keep vegetation from getting so tall that it starts to smother the rocks and the bases of the tree trunks. So only 3 of them in there. Doesn't sound too great a worry to me.
Can I add something on that, please?
Mm-hmm.
And they say that if you have any more than 5 deer per square kilometre in forestry, that you won't get natural regen of tree species. So in a 30-acre patch of land that's 0.12 kilometres, I would say you probably wouldn't want any more than 1 deer in a 30-acre space if you want regen.
That's if you want the regen specifically, yeah. I'm not really so clued up with figures of numbers of animals, depending on what the animals are as well, what kind of deer they are, and I think it could also depend on what kind of forest it is, what kind of natural regeneration you're trying to get. Because I think if it's mainly things like rowan and willows, well, it's very palatable. It can be a bit of a different thing to the less palatable birch and pine as well. Either way, it's not going to be a direct threat in the short term to the mosses, liverworts, and lichens. Not at all. I think they can benefit to some degree by having some grazing there, because it's natural to have some grazing. But exactly what is the totally natural level of grazing, we don't know. It'll vary from one place to another and over time as well.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left for another couple of questions, maybe. Carly?
Okay, well, I've got to pick this one because it's about history. What is known about the extent and diversity of western rainforests through the 18th and 19th centuries? And that's a question from Rob Wilson.
Interesting question, and we don't. I don't think we really know. Well, we can have some clues to the extent from old maps, actually from the 18th and 19th centuries, and indeed those maps do play a part in defining which categories some of these woods are in, like ancient or long established. Here in Scotland, there are two different categories of what broadly go under the term ancient. Whether the map dates from 1750 or 1865. But as for the diversity, I don't think we're in a position to really know, and it would be interesting to know because we can't really. Cause, I mean, like before the Industrial Revolution, things like we know Lobaria pulmonaria, that lichen apparently used to be more widespread. It's a pretty big conspicuous lichen, so more people would have seen it and recorded it. But so many other species wouldn't really have been looked at very much back in those days, and would be very much smaller and less conspicuous. And how much commoner they would be, how much more diverse the woods would be, we just don't know. It would be so interesting to be able to go back in time and see, especially now that we have some of these species coming back, now that sulfur dioxide pollution is at a much lower concentration. As we were thinking, were they there before? Or is it now that things are different, and with climate change as well, are they now spreading into areas of the country that they'd never been to before? So we don't really know about that. One difference, there might be differences to do with grazing as well, though. If some of these woods were on the whole a bit less grazed, then the role of things like honeysuckle might have been greater, in forming a big sort of arboreal climbing mass of stems and foliage, affecting shelter and habitats for things that could be positively and negatively. So it would be interesting to. We don't really know. And I just saw actually in the chat thing, Rose Scott's comment about we don't really know how to assess to properly assess the chat thing's on there, but it's something about to assess whether you've got too many deer in an area or not is to look at the effect that it's having on the habitat, especially the regeneration of the trees and shrubs. Exactly, I agree with that.
Right words, Ro. Last question, Julie.
All right, so this one might be a quick answer then. Mm-hmm. So I think this from Felicity Martin, and I think it's about the effects of ash dieback. So she's asking, do you consider sycamore to be a good replacement species for ash? Is it an honorary naturalised species now?
Yeah, I like sycamore. A lot of people don't like it because it's not native and it's got quite big leaves and they can cast a fair bit of shade and it can grow quite, increase. Great host for epiphytes in the west, mosses, liverworts, and lichens. Some great lobarion assemblages on old sycamores. A great tree. But another one, another really good one I've come to thinking of ash, if we're going to see ash going down, trees to encourage, is goat willow. That can grow into a reasonable sized tree. It's got really good bark from its epiphytic flora. The chemistry of the bark looks just right for the same kind of species that grow on ash. There's quite a rough textured bark. Really good tree. You get a lot of good stuff on goat willow. But yeah, sycamore's good. I wouldn't be that worried about having sycamore in if I had some woodland in the West Highlands or other western places. I wouldn't be worried. I wouldn't be trying to get rid of it. And I would encourage goat willow as well.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, thanks. There's loads of questions there we couldn't get to, unfortunately, but we will record the chat along with this session, and that might allow us to get back to you on some interesting stuff in there. I'm just going to show a couple of final slides. Erin, can you flip those up, please, Erin? Just a little bit of encouragement to consider joining the Native Woodland Discussion Group, which is It's a group of people who go around and have really interesting conversations in native woodlands. So we go to some really cool places all around Scotland. We would have gone to the Lake District this year had it not been for COVID. And it's a really rich place for exchange of ideas and everything else. And our website's there, as is our Twitter and our Facebook group. So please find us there. And also the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest is just getting started. So next slide, Aaron. And really this is about looking after this habitat, making the most of it, and trying to expand it and for it to get traction politically and also just in the public consciousness. It's such a special habitat for Scotland. So the more of that and the more support it can get, the better. So please, if you're active on social media, give us a follow, and ideally give us some tweeting as well using those hashtags there, Saving Scotland's Rainforest. And Julie will faithfully follow you back to keep you in the network. And so apart from that, it really just remains to say thanks to everyone, obviously particularly Ben's fantastic presentation and probably a huge amount of work, but really interesting. So thank you very much, Ben. But also to Julie, Erin, who did the technical stuff, and especially Carly, who did loads of heavy lifting on pulling this together and figuring out how all this stuff works. So thanks very much to them, and thanks to all of yourselves for coming along, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one, whenever that may be. Good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.